served hero and villain alike, and carries with it moral responsibility. To understand the gun is to better understand history. 1938, a powerful and fearsome wave was about to envelop all of Europe. For the second time this century, the German army, the Wehrmacht, was on the move. The soldiers of the Third Reich advanced across the continent and beyond, armed with menacing weapons which became frighteningly familiar by sight, sound, and name. Luger, Mauser, Schmeisser, Walther, the German small arms of World War II. They were some of the most well-crafted weapons the world has ever seen. They were used by one of history's most feared armies to further the aims of one of history's most evil men. A man who helped rebuild the German military in less than 2 decades.
Einem ganzen Leben Inhalt, Sinn und Zweck.
It had begun in the bitter ashes of the First World War. On November 11, 1918, the guns fell silent. The German Wehrmacht had surrendered in humiliating defeat. The Versailles Treaty in 1919 further humiliated Germany by severely limiting the manufacture of small arms that could supply a future army. That army would be limited to less than 100,000 men.
The Treaty of Versailles, which was signed after the end of World War I, forced the German army to become a very small number of soldiers. They had to get rid of all their heavy equipment, and they basically had to start over, a lot of which they did in secret. But they kept the cadre of the NCOs and the officers and the men who were going to formulate the doctrines and ideas that would allow them to rebuild that army very quickly and become the most effective fighting force on the planet.
In 1933, Adolf Hitler became chancellor of a country that was near collapse. Millions of Germans were unemployed. Hitler promised jobs, prosperity, and a return to greatness. He disregarded the Versailles Treaty in order that the production of weapons be resumed. The rest of the world stood by, unwilling or unable to stop the emergence of the Third Reich. The great weapons factories of Germany began belching smoke. Mauser, DWM, Schmeisser, Lova. The manufacturing genius of the nation was in full production. The Wehrmacht was rearming. Germany flexed its muscles and began annexing neighbors without firing a shot. In March 1938, Austria became part of the Third Reich. German troops paraded through the streets of Vienna. As the war machine geared up, the weapons of the past were born again. For the new army, the Luger, or Pistola Parabellum, became the coveted sidearm of the elite officer corps, and later, the infamous SS. The Luger was named after its inventor, Georg Luger. It was first made in 1901 and remained essentially unchanged until 1942, when manufacturing was halted.
The Luger is probably the most recognized pistol design in the world. I doubt if there are very few people who would not recognize the Luger as the German sidearm. It was originally a 7mm caliber pistol, and the German army wanted a little more powerful cartridge, and that was when they developed the larger 9mm pistol round. And since it was used for a military pistol, it earned the designation Parabellum, which means for war. 9mm for war.
The Parabellum is recoil operated and semi-automatic. It weighs 1 pound 13 ounces. Its magazine holds 8 9mm rounds of ammunition. It is milled of steel and blued to a lustrous factory finish. It is said that the Luger is the most balanced pistol design in the world. Its feel is such that when aimed, the weapon almost seems to align itself with the target. Ironically, the Luger had nearly become the official pistol of the United States Army at the turn of the century. Georg Luger himself demonstrated his Pistola Parabellum in America. After exhaustive testing, it was finally rejected for the Colt 45. But in Nazi Germany, the Luger would become the pistol of mystique and legend, a symbol of absolute authority. And though it was eventually overshadowed by a more advanced sidearm, in terms of swagger and sheer theatrics, the Luger would never leave center stage.
There was a large element of theater in the German military. There always has been, going back to the 1840s with the Pickelhaube helmet and the bright shiny brass, the form-fitting uniforms and so on. The Nazis took this to the ultimate. A lot of their military uniforms were designed with the help of their fashion designers and their movie studio folks. Leni Riefenstahl with her Olympic films and the films of the Nuremberg, the staging at the Nuremberg rallies through the 1930s. All of this was designed to create this aura of invincibility, this aura of community, this idea that the Germans were the master race. And it was very effective.
In that context, it can be argued that the Luger symbolized the very soul of the new German army. If so, an infantry rifle was its backbone. The common foot soldier needed a rifle of proven reliability, and the Karabiner 98K filled that need. It was bolt-operated, meaning that the bolt had to be pulled back manually to reload the weapon each time it was fired. It held 5 rounds. Old-fashioned, but amazingly accurate and reliable. Like the Luger, the 98K found its beginnings in the 19th century with the brothers Mauser, Wilhelm and Peter Paul.
Peter Paul Mauser, back in the 1860s and 1870s, designed the first Mauser bolt-action rifle that was much faster to load through the breech than loading through the muzzle.
The Mauser factory at Oberndorf on the Neckar River supplied weapons for the First World War and continued to supply the Army until the end of World War II. The main weapon produced there was the Karabiner 98K.
The K98K, which was the standard Wehrmacht infantry rifle of the war, was little different than the Gewehr 98 with which the Germans had fought the First World War. Indeed, many of the parts were interchangeable. The action was almost identical.
This was the weapon on which every German soldier was trained. Every German soldier knew how to use it. There were other weapons, submachine guns and things like that, but that was the basic weapon.
The 98K was the first building block in a new philosophy of tactics devised by the Wehrmacht command. The gruesome fighting in the trenches of World War I had taught the Germans painful lessons. The new infantry model was a highly mobile regiment centered around machine guns. No more living permanently in a hole and exchanging rifle shots at 2,000 yards. Rapid fire and mobility were the keys. In this scenario, the Karabiner 98K was a critical component, providing solid and valuable support for the machine gun.
The German experience in World War I taught them that you're only going to have your enemy in your target zone for a very short period of time. And because of that, they developed weapons and tactics that would allow them to throw out the maximum amount of firepower in the shortest amount of time.
For the German infantry, maximum firepower translated into Maschinenpistole and Maschinengewehr. Submachine guns and machine guns were the weapons of the future. They would spearhead the concept of blitzkrieg, the lightning wars that were to come. September 1939, the Second World War officially began. Using tactics known as blitzkrieg, lightning war, Germany invaded, and Poland fell in less than 2 weeks.
One of the things about the word Blitzkrieg is that the German army never used it. It was a propaganda word that was developed by Goebbels and the German propaganda ministry. The German army simply developed tactics and refined them that they had found worked at the end of World War I, which were Stoßtruppen, which are basically assault troops.
The attack on Poland stunned the civilized world. 6 long years of bloodshed and brutality lay ahead. However, in this first shocking strike, the new German army had taken on an aura of invincibility.
We know how World War II ended. Germany lost. Therefore, a lot of people just don't understand how much fear the German army had put into people of my father's generation and people who grew up watching Germany conquer most of Europe. The fact of the matter is that the German army was incredibly efficient, incredibly good at what it did, and it took a long time to finally beat them down. And had to go up against helps you appreciate why people respect them even today for what they were able to achieve and how difficult it was to finally defeat them.
But defeating the Germans meant adjusting to their new style of attack and to a new generation of advanced small arms. The German infantry squad of 10 men was structured around the machine gun. The rifleman's key task was to support and protect it. The first truly versatile German machine gun, the Maschinengewehr 34, was adopted by the Wehrmacht in 1934. German weapons can be identified this way by the year they entered service. MG-34, machine gun accepted into service in 1934.
Behind me here is the MG-34, perhaps the most effective machine gun on any side during World War II. It was relatively light, was easy to carry by a 2-man squad. One man carried the tripod, which was the heaviest part of it. The other carried the machine gun.
Now, the Germans had a rather different philosophy than anybody else on machine guns. They didn't believe in having light and heavy weapons. They said one machine gun can do all the jobs.
The MG-34 was highly adaptable. It could be used as a light machine gun on a bipod for offensive firefights and rapid advancement. One man could carry it and fire it. In critical situations, the German machine gun could be fired, supported on the back of another squad member, or from the prone position with the bipod. For maximum accuracy and efficiency, the MG-34 was mounted on a tripod with traverse and search mechanisms. In this mode, it was used as a heavy machine gun in defensive positions, or for sustained fire to protect advancing infantry. The weapon itself weighed 26.7 pounds. It was air-cooled and recoil-operated with a high cyclic rate of fire, about 800 rounds per minute.
In fact, the MG-34 was set up so that it featured 2 modes of fire, one being single shot or semi-automatic fire, and one being fully automatic fire. It was possible to fire it semi-automatic.
The MG-34 was clearly state-of-the-art, superior to all other machine guns of the time. Its manufacture was meticulous. Like all German weapons, each part of the MG-34 was individually inspected and received an approval stamp before assembly. In the field, the MG-34 fell under the command of one man in each unit, the squad leader.
The squad leader was the man responsible for directing where it should be set up. He had a primary and a secondary position. He determined where the best zones of fire would be, whether they're going to be on offensive or defensive mode. And then the other riflemen in the squad would either carry the ammunition or they would be set up to protect the flanks, in other words, so that the enemy couldn't get behind them. And it was his job to direct it, to put it in a safe position where it could do the most damage.
Versatility was also crucial. Every German soldier was trained to be proficient with all of the weapons used by the infantry squad. During World War II, Wolfgang Seipt was a German squad leader on the Russian front. Today, he is a retired physician and an American citizen.
We were definitely trained with the basic weapons of the infantry, because we actually were assault infantry, with the rifle 98K, with pistols. At this time it was the Luger 08 9mm pistol, and also with the first semi-automatic and automatic machine pistols. The just developed MP38 as MP40 and 41, we had training in those.
Maschinenpistole translates literally to machine pistol or submachine gun. It fired pistol caliber ammunition. In the case of the MP38, 9mm Patrona, bullets. Its detachable magazine held 32 parabellum caliber rounds.
The MP38 was your basic German submachine gun. The difference is that a submachine gun fires pistol ammunition, whereas a machine gun fires much larger cartridges, which gives you greater range and accuracy.
Often called a Schmeisser, the MP38 had a very rapid rate of fire, approximately 450 to 550 rounds per minute. It weighed 8.87 pounds unloaded and 10.37 loaded. Although it would ultimately be replaced by the MP40, the MP38 would remain the most famous of the machine pistols.
The machine pistol 38 was the trademark of the German army, really. No television producer, no movie producer would dream of putting a German soldier on unless he had this in his hand, the MP38. Commonly called the Schmeisser. Schmeisser had nothing whatever to do with it, actually. He didn't design it, he just happened to run a factory that made it.
Schmeisser or MP38, no matter the name, it was one of the preferred weapons of the Wehrmacht soldier.
We liked the MP38 for the reason it was an enormous firepower available if you needed, especially in a near-fight condition, a hand-to-hand combat, of which we had up to 2 a day. And this was excellent because you really could feel secure going through the dense brush and being ready to fire at any time without any hesitation. The shoulder stock was made out of metal, not wood, and could be folded under very easily. And you could use it then, it was actually almost a pistol. You could use a pistol with the stock folded under. You could use it as an MP, a machine pistol, and you could use it as a light machine gun.
The weapon was admired by soldiers on both sides. Karl Wolf, an infantry captain in the United States Army during the European campaign, recalls the winter of 1944.
I just was impressed with their P-38, we call them burp guns. And so sometime in November or December, I started carrying one because it was lighter. And it had clips with quite a few rounds in it. I've forgotten how many, 12, 14. And I just found it convenient to carry because it was light and very effective.
Machine guns and machine pistolas had ignited the Blitzkrieg. As World War II commenced, new and ever more deadly weapons would appear in the arsenal of German small arms. After the fall of Poland, France and England declared war on Germany. The Third Reich never flinched. They knew they had the advantage, and they continued to attack.
If you have two sides that are equipped about the same, trained about the same, the edge is going to go to the side that has some experience in combat before they meet. The Germans had done operations in Austria and Czechoslovakia. Then they attacked Poland in 1939, and they got practical combat experience during that campaign. By the time they hit France, They had combat experience, whereas the French and the British did not. And it was that experience which continued to build and give them the advantage every time they came up against another country.
The expanding inventory of German small arms played a crucial role as Hitler launched his blitzkrieg again and again. Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg all fell before the relentless advance of German infantry and rapid assault airborne troops.
They had paratroop units, and they decided to develop a special automatic rifle, assault rifle, for the Fallschirmjäger, the paratroops. It was called the FG series.
The German language is famous for its use of long compound words. In this case, the translation of Fallschirmjägergewehr is parachute hunter's rifle. It was carried by the airborne troops, highly specialized assault forces who were delivered into combat by the Luftwaffe, the Air Force. The Fallschirmjägergewehr was shorter than the MP-38, and it was a rifle as opposed to a pistol. It weighed in at 9.9 pounds. Its magazines held 10 or 20 rounds of 7.92 millimeter caliber. It was gas-operated and air-cooled, semi or full automatic. Its effective range with bipod and telescopic sights was about 1,000 meters.
Now, the unique thing about it is that this one used a full-size rifle cartridge, not the shorter automatic rifle cartridge. But because it was so big, it had a tremendous kick, and it was almost impossible to control it on a fully auto method.
Still, the weapon was highly effective. Even when it didn't hit anyone, it often frightened soldiers into surrendering with its awesome firepower and the noise it made. Though the gun saw only limited use, it helped expand the specific military designation of German small arms.
One of the problems the Germans actually had in World War II with small arms development is that they simply were making too many different types, too many different prototypes. They would get onto an idea and they'd spend a lot of resources on it.
New sidearms were also being introduced to meet new demands.
Germany was the most pistol-intensive military that's ever been known. Germany, unlike other countries, regarded the pistol as a practical weapon. She didn't regard it as a badge of rank or a badge of honor. Germans were issued handguns on a wide scale for a number of reasons. First of all, you had occupation forces in all of the occupied countries. Many of those people were civilians. They had to be armed. The pistol was the most appropriate thing to arm them with. Similarly, staff officers or supply officers or rear echelon troops in the occupied nations also had to be issued weapons for their self-protection. And again, here the pistol was most appropriate. So the Germans took the handgun more seriously than any other country in the Second World War.
By 1940, the Germans were mass-producing the sidearm that would ultimately replace the revered Luger, the Walther P-38.
The Luger was a single-action pistol. Every time you pulled the trigger, it reloaded itself, and there was no way, if the pistol jammed, to clear the jam or to refire the cartridge without having to go through the procedure of pulling back this heavy toggle and letting it go forward. So the Luger pistol was replaced by the P-38, which was developed by the Walther Company. And this also had a large capacity magazine. It holds 9 rounds, another one in the chamber. And it works essentially the same way. When the slide goes forward, it strips a cartridge off the magazine into the chamber. But this one had an exposed hammer. Now let's say you had a cartridge that did not fire the first time. You simply pull the trigger, and you might pull it a second time and the cartridge would go off.
This is probably regarded as the best pistol of World War II. And the reason that it's regarded so highly is that unlike most semi-automatic pistols, which require you pull the slide back on top to cock the hammer and send a round into the chamber, all you have to do with the Walther is pull the trigger. the first puller and fires the round, but there's already a round in the chamber when this is loaded. This gives you a tremendous advantage over somebody who's trying desperately to get their gun ready to fire when you're ready to go right now.
By the middle of 1941, the small arms of the Wehrmacht were employed in the far corners of Europe and Africa. But the ultimate test lay ahead, the Eastern Front.
Repeatedly on the Eastern Front, the Germans were able to put together these battle groups on an emergency basis. And one of the reasons they lasted so long is because the German officers were trained at every level to be able to operate with infantry, which was the basic backbone. We think of panzers, we think of aircraft and so forth, but infantry fought most of the combat in World War II on everybody's side, and the German army lasted as long as it did because of a basic superiority in machine guns, a basic superiority in leadership, and a tactical doctrine that allowed them to use that to their advantage against everybody.
The German army moved through Russia, inflicting horrible losses upon the antiquated Russian forces. The Red Army fell like flies to the withering firepower of MG-34s, MP-38s, and the lightning tactics employed by the Wehrmacht.
One way to gauge how effective the German tactics, weapons, and doctrine were is the casualty rates, which you can just look at statistics. In other words, how many casualties were inflicted on each side and what they admit they lost. On the Eastern Front against the Russians, the Germans lost 1 man to every 15 the Russians lost.
We learned about their casualties and inflicted by how many machine gun positions and so on. And we were not aware that before the invasion of Russia started, that 14.5 million Russian soldiers were assembled on the west front of Russia facing 1.5 million German troops.
Despite the odds, the early German victories were overwhelming and the Russian losses were staggering. At the core of the fighting was the all-important machine gun squad. The secret of their tactics was fluidity of movement. Hit and run, and never allow anyone to get behind the squad.
The machine gunner definitely decimated enormously the infantry, the attacking infantry. The Russian infantry usually followed right the tanks. And if you were sitting there with your machine gun and you were able to pick out the accompanying infantry very easily, because in Russia you hardly have any trees unless you're in a forest area of the west.
As the mighty Wehrmacht reached the gates of Moscow, the tide was about to turn. The Russian skies darkened and snow began to fall in blinding sheets. In addition to the bitter cold, the sheer size of the Russian army began to overwhelm the Germans. Superior tactics and weaponry were not enough. Hitler called for a strategic withdrawal. He would not use the word retreat. The Wehrmacht fell back. That same winter, the entry of the United States into the war brought increasing pressure on the Nazi war machine. Still, German ingenuity would prove a formidable foe. American troops arriving in Europe would be greeted by a devastating new machine gun and by rumors of a super powerful assault rifle. In early 1942, American troops poured into England, Ireland, and Scotland. The Yanks had arrived. Soon, they pushed off for French North Africa, Operation Torch. They assaulted the beaches, met little opposition, and the city of Algiers was quickly liberated. In the Kasserni Pass in Algeria, American GIs came face to face with the latest addition to the German small arm arsenal, the MG-42, the Maschinengewehr 42. This mass-produced version of the MG-34 had a rate of fire so dazzling that it sounded like one long continuous burst when fired. Due to the rapid rate of fire, the barrel of the Maschinengewehr would quickly overheat. A spare barrel was part of the standard equipment package and could be replaced in less than 2 minutes. An asbestos pad for protection against the heat was also standard equipment. With an increased rate of fire to about 1,500 rounds per minute, the MG-42 was devastating for both practical and psychological reasons.
The one weapon the Germans had that was really feared in World War II was the MG-42 machine gun. One of the main differences between it and the earlier MG-34 it replaced was its rate of fire. It was so high a rate of fire that you couldn't hear individual shots. In other words, on the MG-34 you could hear da-da-da, da-da-da, da-da. With the MG-42 it was zip, just like that. You couldn't even hear individual rounds, and this is so intimidating that people would stop and go to ground as soon as they heard it, even if it wasn't aiming at them.
That frightful sound would echo through the end of the war. The United States Army even made a special training film to deal with the psychological impact of the weapon, to lessen the fear of the green recruit who would face the amazing firepower of the dreaded MG-42.
Listen to that. Fast. That thing sprays a lot of lead. And you're scared, because the German gun fires faster than anything you've run into before. So much faster than the slow, steady bark of American machine guns you heard all through training. When you know the drawbacks of these enemy weapons and realize that their bark is worse than their bite, you aren't afraid of some unknown thing.
In truth, its bite was very bad. And Germany was able to produce MG-42s at an alarming rate. The Allied High Command was intensely aware that crippling Germany's manufacturing genius was key to winning the war. Factories like Mauser, DWM, Lova, and Haenel had to be shut down. Allied bombing began, but the great factories continued to produce, even when badly damaged. And new weapons were on the drawing boards. Emerging from research and development was a small arm that would revolutionize the concept of the military assault rifle, the Sturmgewehr 44. By early 1942, it was in the works. In late 1943, it was ready for field tests.
This is the first of the really effective assault rifles. This has all the characteristics and qualifications for an assault rifle. It is selective fire, semi-automatic to full automatic. It fires a mid-range cartridge that is not as powerful as a rifle cartridge, more powerful than a pistol cartridge. It has a large magazine capacity of 30 rounds. And it was an extremely effective rifle. It was issued in as widely as the Germans could manufacture them beginning in the spring of 1944, and was used on both the Eastern and Western fronts.
It is one of the ironies of the war that the Sturmgewehr would never have been created if the decision had been left to Adolf Hitler. Hitler had little interest in developing new rifles. He preferred rapid-fire machine guns that could overwhelm the enemy. But he had heard about the new weapon being tested on the Eastern Front. It was then called the MP-43-44, and Hitler was led to believe that it was a submachine gun.
Hitler had a conference of commanders from the Eastern Front on this, that, and the other. Now, what do you need? And one of them said, a lot more of these new rifles. And Hitler said, what rifle? And of course, the fat was in the fire then. But once he saw the rifle and once he heard what it could do, he was so delighted he christened it the assault rifle, or Sturmgewehr. And it became a standard weapon. And it is the forefather of all modern military rifles, because all modern military rifles adhere to the same philosophy: small cartridge, light rifle, short range.
The Sturmgewehr 44 is an air-cooled semi and fully automatic rifle. Its weight when loaded is 11.5 pounds. Its detachable steel magazine holds 30 rounds of 7.92 Kurz, short ammunition. Its rate of fire is between 500 to 600 rounds per minute. It was arguably the premier small arm of its time. In spite of intense Allied factory bombings, nearly 500,000 Sturmgewehrs were produced. Fortunately for the Allies, less than 1/3 reached the front lines, and the weapon had little impact on the war.
The goal, I'm sure, of the German army was to issue one of these to every soldier, but they just did not have the manufacturing capacity. There were many units that continued to use the bolt-action car rifle right up until the end of the war.
By the spring of 1944, time was running out for the so-called Thousand-Year Reich. The glory of the Blitzkrieg had faded. The small arms of the Wehrmacht were now being utilized in defensive tactics, as more and more German positions were overrun and destroyed. June 6, 1944. The largest armada in history was about to unleash an invasion on Adolf Hitler's Fortress Europe. Normandy, France was the chosen spot. The Germans were waiting. The destiny of the Western world was about to be decided, but the main concern of the individual infantrymen on both sides was survival. For American soldiers, that meant avoiding deadly German machine guns placed in defensive positions.
As far as the effectiveness of German machine guns, I have one testimonial for it, is that when we landed on D-Day and just came off the landing craft, the first few people were killed outright by a burst. And I scooted off to the right diagonal. On the right-hand side was a sergeant and a private. And all of a sudden, I looked off to the right diagonal, and I saw this ripple of water. And about 30 seconds later, the two men on my right floated off. That was, in fact, the result of this German machine gun fire, which was very accurate.
Despite the accuracy and tremendous rate of fire, the German machine gun squads were soon falling in retreat to the ever-advancing Allied forces. The Wehrmacht soldiers often found themselves locked in house-to-house combat in one small French town after another. Miracle weapons became the order of the day. One, called a Krümmerlauf, was a 90-degree curved barrel that was designed to fit onto a Sturmgewehr 44.
It came into limited use for street fighting, for poking it round the corner and shooting somebody round the corner. And it was a very simple device. It was just a bent piece of tube clamped on the muzzle with holes drilled in it to let some of the gas out as the bullet turned the corner. And it lasted for, I don't know, 200 or 300 shots, I think, after which time it had worn itself away and the bullets were allowed to come out through one of the holes. But it was effective in limited circumstances.
Another strange weapon employed by the Wehrmacht was the Leuchtpistole, a flare gun that was converted to fire grenades and small exploding shells. It too was effective in limited circumstances. In the final months of 1944, the Germans mounted one last great counterattack. The advance punched a big dent into the Allied lines and became known as the Battle of the Bulge. But it was too late. The new assault rifle, the Sturmgewehr 44, and all the other weapons just wouldn't work without ammunition. In the end, the weapons didn't fail, the system did. Supplies out of Germany were drying up. The day and night bombings had destroyed the heart of German manufacturing. The Allied march toward Berlin and final victory was on.
I would think most historians would agree that the Germans were generally overwhelmed by the West's superior manufacturing capability. Plus the fact the Germans had now been at war for over 6 years. The Americans had only been at war for 3 to 4 years, and we were still quite fresh. And we carried a good part of the war in the West.
I believe that with the assault on Russia, automatically came the end of the Third Reich. There was simply no way Germany could carry on war on two fronts. The sheer size of the territory to be occupied and the relatively small number of people to occupy it themselves represented enormous problems for Germany.
By March 1945, the great German counterattack was in shambles, as was the capital city of Berlin. The final act had begun. Hitler, perhaps totally mad, ordered Germany to destroy itself and then retreated into his final headquarters, an underground bunker. On April 30th, 1945, the leader of the Thousand-Year Reich placed a pistol to his head and brought his dreams of world domination to an abrupt end. The Russians were the first on the scene and found the burned remains. Rumors began at once. Hitler was dead, had shot himself with the Pistola Parabellum, the Luger.
One of the myths about Hitler's suicide was that he shot himself with a Luger pistol. What he shot himself with was a Walther PPK. PPK stands for a police pistol, which is small and concealable. He actually carried two Walther PPKs. One was a 6.35 millimeter or 25 caliber that he wore in a leather holster inside his pants near his right pocket. He killed himself, however, with the larger caliber, the 32 caliber or 7.65 millimeter Walther, and that's the one that is responsible for Hitler's death.
The German small arms, the individual weapons of war, were surrendered and tossed into the scrap heap of history. From the end of World War I to the end of World War II, the number of firearms manufactured was staggering. 14 million Karabiner 98Ks, 1.2 million Lugers, 1.1 million Walther P38s, over 1 million machine pistols, 425,000 Sturmgewehr 44s, the world's first functional assault rifle. And finally, the machine guns. MG-34 production, which continued nearly to war's end, stood at 400,000. Over 700,000 MG-42s were produced. The final tally in numbering the 8 primary German small arms of World War II totals over 20 million weapons manufactured.
Weapons themselves somehow came with a look that was imposing. If you look at a Luger, if you look at a P-38, if you look at an MG-34 or 42, it looks like something out of the future, particularly at that time. So the look matched the reputation or matched that mindset. Then you got to performance. You had a performance that kind of went along with the reputation and went along with the look.
If there's a legacy of World War II on German small arms, if you look at the way that weaponry has been developed to today, the firepower has geometrically increased at the squad level. We now have a basic machine gun, an M60, which again is like the MG-42 is your main weapon. You have M16s, which are fully auto and semi-auto assault rifles that are supporting it. So if you take a look at it, you can't say that we copied the Germans exactly, but they certainly influenced the way that we developed our infantry squads and our tactics since World War II.
They were engineering masterpieces. Designed by brilliant and dedicated minds, they hold many spellbound with their beauty and awesome power. Yet their lasting legacy has little to do with technological achievement. In the eyes of history, these guns will forever be linked with the darkest impulses of human nature.
Marschiert Deutschland und hinter uns kommt